Case 1. Gertrude Baniszewski. October 26, 1965. Indianapolis, Indiana. Marion County. It began with a business arrangement. In the summer of 1965, a woman named Gertrude Baniszewski made an agreement with a couple named Lester and Betty Likens. The Likens were carnival workers, traveling from town to town with their work, and they needed someone to watch their two daughters, 16-year-old Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny, while they were on the road. Gertrude Baniszewski, a 46-year-old divorced mother of 7 living in a cramped house on East New York Street in Indianapolis, agreed to take the girls in for $20 a week. It seemed, on the surface, like a practical solution for both families. The Likens' parents would have their children cared for. Baniszewski would have a modest income to supplement what little she had. The girls would have a roof over their heads. On paper, it looked like the kind of informal arrangement that working-class families made all the time. What followed was anything but ordinary. Within days of Sylvia and Jenny Likens moving into the Baniszewski home, the payments from the Likens' parents fell behind. That was all the justification Gertrude Baniszewski needed. What began as verbal cruelty, mocking Sylvia in front of her own children, calling her names, humiliating her at every opportunity, quickly escalated into something far darker. Baniszewski began to physically beat Sylvia, at first with her hands, and then with paddles, belts, and whatever else was within reach. She encouraged her own children, as well as neighborhood children who came and went from the house, to participate in the abuse. And many of them did. Sylvia Likens was 16 years old. She was described by people who knew her as a quiet, sweet girl, someone who did not make trouble, who did not fight back, who trusted the adults around her to treat her with basic human decency. That trust was used against her in the most brutal way imaginable. Over the course of approximately 3 months, Sylvia was subjected to a systematic campaign of torture that investigators would later describe as among the worst they had ever encountered. She was beaten almost daily by Baniszewski, by her children, by children from the neighborhood who were encouraged, coached, and sometimes pressured into participating. She was starved, denied adequate food while the rest of the household ate. She was burned, not once, not twice, but with over 100 cigarettes, the scars catalogued across her body like a map of cruelty. She was forced to eat feces and drink urine. She was made to perform degrading acts in front of others for the entertainment of her tormentors. But perhaps the act that would come to define the case in the public consciousness was what Baniszewski did with a sewing needle in her own hand. She carved words into Sylvia's abdomen. The words were a declaration, a branding of the girl as something less than human, as someone who belonged to no one and deserved nothing. The words were carved while Sylvia was still alive, unable to resist, too broken and too weak to fight back. Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, was present throughout much of the abuse. She was threatened repeatedly, told that what was happening to Sylvia would happen to her too if she told anyone. Jenny had a physical disability that made her particularly vulnerable. She watched her sister deteriorate day by day and was powerless to stop it. Attempts were made to reach out for help. Sylvia reportedly tried on at least one occasion to alert someone outside the home. Those attempts were intercepted. Neighbors reported hearing screaming from the house at various points during the summer and early fall of 1965. Nothing was done. No one intervened. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens died. She was 16 years old. The official cause of death was subdural hematoma, internal hemorrhaging, shock, and severe malnutrition. Her body bore evidence of everything that had been done to her. The burns, the cuts, the bruises layered upon bruises, the signs of prolonged starvation. The medical examiner's findings painted a portrait of months of sustained, deliberate, escalating violence. When investigators arrived at the Baniszewski home, they found Sylvia's body on a dirty mattress in the basement. Jenny Likens, in a moment of extraordinary courage, whispered to one of the officers, "Get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." She did, and what she described would shock the city of Indianapolis, the state of Indiana, and the nation. Gertrude Baniszewski was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Several of her children and a neighborhood teenager named Richard Hobbs were also charged. The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Indiana history. The prosecutor, Leroy New, stood before the jury and stated plainly that what had been done to Sylvia Likens was the most terrible crime ever committed in the state of Indiana. It was not an exaggeration. Legal scholars would cite the case for decades as a landmark study in complicity, crowd psychology, and the failure of community protective instincts. Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Her conviction was appealed, retried, and ultimately upheld. She served over 20 years before being granted parole in 1985, a decision that was met with public outrage. She moved out of state under a changed name and died of lung cancer in 1990. She never expressed meaningful remorse for what she had done to Sylvia Likens. Sylvia Marie Likens would have been in her mid-70s today. Instead, she is forever 16, a girl who came to Indianapolis looking for a temporary home and found only suffering. Her story has been told in books, documentaries, and films, but no retelling can fully capture the reality of what she endured or the failure of every adult who could have helped her and did not. She deserved better. She deserved everything. If this case moved you, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. And if you are new to True Crime Silent Files, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new documentary. These stories matter, and so does your support in helping us tell them. Case 2. Amber Pasztor. September 26, 2016. Elkhart County, Indiana. The Amber Alert came through on a Tuesday morning, and for many people across Indiana, it was the kind of notification that made them hold their breath and check the news. 2 children were missing. Their mother had taken them. Law enforcement was asking the public for help. What no one knew yet, what could not have been imagined by the thousands of people who saw that alert flash across their phones and television screens, was that by the time the alert was issued, it was already too late. The children were already gone. And their mother, Amber Pasztor, was the reason why. Amber Pasztor was 30 years old in September of 2016, living in Fort Wayne, Indiana. She had 2 young children, 7-year-old Liliana Hernandez and 6-year-old Renee Pasztor, but she did not have custody of them. A court had determined that she was not the appropriate primary caregiver for her children, and they were living with their grandfather. By all outward appearances, a system had been put in place to keep those children safe. On the morning of September 26, 2016, Amber Pasztor broke into her father's home. She took her children. She put them in a vehicle and she drove. The drive covered approximately 70 miles, from Fort Wayne heading northeast toward Elkhart, Indiana. During the journey, Pasztor made stops. She bought things. She appeared, to anyone who might have seen her, to be a mother traveling with her children. Ordinary, unremarkable, invisible. The children were alive during those stops. They were breathing, present, unaware of what their mother had already decided. What Pasztor had decided was this. She was going to kill her children. Her stated reason, offered to investigators later with a clarity that was chilling precisely because it was so earnest, was that she wanted to keep them safe and usher them to heaven. In her mind, according to her own account, killing her children was an act of love. It was protection. It was mercy. The world, she believed, was too dangerous a place for them to survive in without her, and since she could not be with them, she would send them somewhere she believed they would be safe forever. The theology of her reasoning was as distorted as everything else about what she did that day. Somewhere on that 70-mile drive, or shortly after its end, Amber Pasztor used her bare hands to smother 7-year-old Liliana. Then she smothered 6-year-old Renee. She killed both of her children with her hands. In the back seat of a vehicle. Alone on a road in Indiana. When it was done, she drove to the Elkhart Police Department. She parked behind the building. She got out of the vehicle and flagged down a police officer. And she told him, calmly, directly, without hysteria or apparent distress, that she had 2 dead people in her back seat. The officer approached the vehicle. He looked inside. Liliana and Renee Pasztor were there, exactly as their mother had said. Both were dead. The investigation that followed was as straightforward as it was heartbreaking. There was no mystery about who had done this. Amber Pasztor had not fled, had not hidden, had not attempted any deception beyond the ordinary act of driving across a state highway with 2 living children. She had come to the police herself. She had told them what she had done. She cooperated fully with investigators, explaining her reasoning in detail that suggested she believed, on some level, that her actions were justified. She was charged with 2 counts of murder. She entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill, a legal designation in Indiana that acknowledges the presence of mental illness while still assigning criminal responsibility. She was sentenced to 130 years in prison. But the story of Amber Pasztor did not end there. While awaiting trial for the murders of her children, investigators connected her to a separate crime, the murder of a man named Frank McClure, a neighbor who had been killed prior to the events of September 26th. Pasztor was ultimately convicted of that murder as well, adding additional decades and additional weight to a sentence that already stretched well beyond any single human lifetime. Liliana Hernandez was 7 years old. Renee Pasztor was 6. They went with their mother on a Tuesday morning in September, and they did not come home. The grandfather who had been caring for them, the system that had tried to protect them, the Amber Alert that had tried to find them, none of it was enough. There are people who argue that mental illness is a mitigating factor in cases like this, and those conversations are legitimate and important. But in the quiet of a car on a highway in Indiana, 2 children took their last breaths. And the person who took those breaths from them was the one person in the world who was supposed to protect them above all others. If you found this case important, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear these stories. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Your support means everything to this channel and to the mission of keeping these names alive. Case 3. Brandi Worley. November 17, 2016. Montgomery County, Indiana. The knife had been purchased in advance. That detail, quiet, deliberate, premeditated, is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what Brandi Worley did in the early morning hours of November 17, 2016, in the small town of Darlington, Indiana. This was not an act of sudden madness. This was not a momentary break from reality. This was planned. The weapon had been selected, purchased, and hidden. The night had been chosen. The children had been positioned. What Brandi Worley did that night was a choice. The Worley family, Brandi, her husband Jason, their 7-year-old son Tyler, and their 3-year-old daughter Charlie, lived in a home in Darlington, a quiet community in Montgomery County in the west-central part of Indiana. From the outside, they were an ordinary family. From the inside, the marriage had deteriorated to a breaking point. Jason Worley had filed for divorce. He had told his wife that their marriage was over. And in the days that followed that announcement, Brandi Worley made a calculation that no person, no parent, should ever make. She decided that if she was going to lose her children in a divorce, no one was going to have them. In the early morning hours of November 17th, Brandi Worley went to her son Tyler's room. She woke him up. She told him they were going to have a sleepover in his little sister Charlie's room, a detail that, in retrospect, is almost unbearable in its intimacy. She used the language of warmth and togetherness to position her children for what she had already decided to do. Once they were together in Charlie's room, Brandi Worley took out the combat knife she had purchased and hidden. She straddled her 7-year-old son, and she stabbed him, multiple times, with force, with intent. Tyler Worley was 7 years old. He was in his pajamas. He had been woken from sleep by his mother and told they were going to have a special night together. Then she turned to 3-year-old Charlie. She stabbed her as well. Her husband Jason was asleep downstairs. He heard nothing. He was still asleep when Brandi Worley picked up her phone and dialed 911. The call is part of the public record. What investigators and prosecutors noted, what everyone who heard the recording would later comment on, was the tone of Brandi Worley's voice when she spoke to the dispatcher. She was calm. Not the calm of shock, not the flat effect of someone dissociating from trauma, but the composed, matter-of-fact calm of someone reporting something they had done deliberately and without internal conflict. She told the dispatcher, in words that have since been repeated in every account of this case, "I just stabbed myself and killed my 2 children." She had also stabbed herself in the neck. The wound was not fatal. She survived. When law enforcement arrived at the Worley home, they found Tyler and Charlie. Both children had died from their stab wounds. Brandi Worley was still in the home, injured but alive. In the investigation that followed, Brandi Worley spoke to detectives. She told them why she had done it. She said, "My husband wanted a divorce and wanted to take my kids." That was her explanation. That was the entirety of her justification for taking the lives of her 7-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter. Her husband was going to leave her. She was going to lose custody. And so she decided that the children would not survive the divorce. Tyler Worley loved superheroes. Charlie Worley had just turned 3. They were children in the fullest and most complete sense of the word, growing, learning, alive with the particular energy of young people who have no concept yet of the complexity or cruelty that the world can contain. They had no idea that their mother had already decided they would not see another morning. Brandi Worley was charged with 2 counts of murder. She was convicted and sentenced to 120 years in prison. She will not be eligible for release within any reasonable calculation of a human lifespan. Jason Worley lost his marriage, his children, and the life he had known in a single night. Tyler and Charlie lost everything. The knife had been purchased in advance. Brandi Worley had time to think about what she was going to do, time to prepare, and time to carry it out. At every stage, there was an opportunity to stop, to put the knife down, to think of her children's faces and choose differently. She did not. Please take a moment to like this video in honor of Tyler and Charlie Worley. Leave a comment below. These children deserve to be remembered. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. We will never stop telling these stories. Case 4. Naomi Briner. December 12, 2023. Jefferson County, Indiana. The fire was visible from the road. In the early morning hours of December 12, 2023, emergency services received a call about a house fire on East Telegraph Hill Road, a rural stretch of Jefferson County in the southeastern corner of Indiana, not far from the Ohio River city of Madison. Firefighters responded and worked to bring the blaze under control. What they found inside the home when the smoke began to clear was not simply the aftermath of a residential fire. It was a crime scene. 4 people were dead inside that house, and 4 people had been shot. The victims were 35-year-old Naomi Briner and her 3 children, 12-year-old Adelia, 8-year-old Leland, and 6-year-old Isla. All 4 had died from gunshot wounds. The fire had been set after the shootings, a detail that investigators would note in the official findings of the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office. The investigation that followed was methodical and careful, as investigations in cases involving children must be. Autopsies were performed. Evidence was processed. The Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office reviewed the findings in their entirety before releasing their official conclusion that Naomi Briner had shot and killed her 3 children, Adelia, Leland, and Isla, before dying by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The children's deaths were ruled homicides. The fire, investigators concluded, had been set in connection with the shootings. In cases of familicide, the killing of one's own family members, investigators look carefully at the circumstances leading up to the event, the mental state of the perpetrator, the family dynamics, the presence or absence of warning signs, the question of whether anyone could have known what was coming and intervened in time. In the Briner case, those questions were asked, but the answers, as is so often the case, came too late to save the children. Adelia Briner was 12 years old enough to have had friendships, passions, a sense of her own identity beginning to form. Leland Briner was 8. Isla Briner was 6. They were children living in a rural Indiana home, and on the night of December 12, 2023, they were killed by the person who was supposed to protect them from every danger the world had to offer. The Jefferson County community, a relatively small, close-knit region where news travels through personal connections as much as through formal media, was shaken by what had happened on East Telegraph Hill Road. Rural Indiana communities are not immune to tragedy, but an event of this magnitude, involving 3 children killed in their own home, leaves marks that do not fade quickly. In the weeks and months following the discovery, local officials, counselors, and community leaders worked to support those affected by the loss. Classmates of Adelia and Leland, teachers, neighbors, members of the community who had known the family or known of them. No amount of community support can fill the particular absence left by 3 children who should still be alive. Adelia, who at 12 was standing at the threshold of her teenage years. Leland, who at 8 was in the thick of elementary school, of sports and friendships, and the million small discoveries of childhood. Isla, who at 6 was just beginning to learn how wide and full the world could be. They were all still learning. They did not get the chance to finish. Naomi Briner is gone as well, taking with her whatever answers might have helped the people left behind understand why. In cases where the perpetrator does not survive, the why becomes a question that families, communities, and investigators wrestle with for years. What was she thinking? What had she felt in the days and weeks before? Were there signs? Was there anything that could have been done? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that keep the people who loved those children awake at night. What we know for certain is this: Adelia, Leland, and Isla Briner deserve to grow up. They deserve the ordinary, extraordinary gift of a long life. They did not receive it. Please like this video and leave a comment for Adelia, Leland, and Isla. Their names deserve to be spoken. And please subscribe to True Crime Silent Files if you haven't already. Every subscription helps this channel keep telling the stories that cannot be allowed to fade into silence. Case 5. DeJuane Anderson. April 16, 2022. Washington County, Indiana. He was found in a suitcase. That is the fact that stops people cold when they first hear it. The detail that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. A child. A suitcase. A wooded road in southern Indiana. And a story that would take investigators, journalists, and the public nearly 2 years to fully understand. On April 16, 2022, a person out searching for mushrooms in the rural woods of Washington County, Indiana, made a discovery that no one expects and no one forgets. Approximately 80 feet off a rural road, a stretch that locals had taken to calling Suitcase Road for reasons that would only become tragically ironic in retrospect, the mushroom hunter found a suitcase. It was brightly colored, covered in a Las Vegas-themed print. It was the kind of bag designed to be noticed on a luggage carousel, cheerful and distinctive. And inside it was the body of a little boy. The child was 5 years old. He had dark hair. He was dressed. And investigators had absolutely no idea who he was. The process of identifying an unidentified child is one of the most difficult and emotionally demanding tasks in law enforcement. In this case, it took 6 months. For 6 months, this child was a John Doe, a little boy with no name, no known family, no one who had reported him missing. The fact that no one had come forward to say that a 5-year-old child was gone from their lives was itself a statement of devastating significance. Investigators worked the case with everything they had. They processed the suitcase, the child's clothing, the surrounding area. They collected fingerprints from trash bags found inside the suitcase along with the boy's body. Those fingerprints would eventually prove to be the key to the entire case. The fingerprints led investigators to DeJuane Anderson, a woman from the Louisville, Kentucky area who had been living with her son, the little boy in the suitcase, in the months before his death. The child's name was Cairo Jordan. He was 5 years old. He had been alive as recently as weeks before his body was discovered, and he had been in his mother's care for every day of his short life. As investigators dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding Cairo's death, a picture emerged that was as disturbing as any detail in the case. In the days and weeks before Cairo's body was found, DeJuane Anderson had posted on social media about her belief that her son was possessed by a demon. She had attempted to contact a religious figure about performing an exorcism on the child. Whatever was happening in that household, whatever Anderson believed about her son, whatever had been driving her behavior in the period leading up to his death, it had clearly escalated to a point that ended in Cairo Jordan's death. The medical examiner determined that Cairo died from an electrolyte imbalance consistent with severe dehydration and untreated illness. This was not a sudden, explosive act of violence. This was a child who became desperately, fatally ill and received no medical care. A child who needed a hospital and instead was placed in a suitcase and left in the woods. A co-defendant in the case, a woman named Dawn Coleman, was separately arrested, charged, and ultimately sentenced to between 25 and 30 years in prison for her role in events connected to Cairo's death. DeJuane Anderson did not wait to be arrested. After Cairo's body was found, and as the investigation progressed, she fled. For nearly 2 years, she evaded law enforcement, living under the radar while investigators worked to locate her. It was not until March of 2024, nearly 2 years after Cairo's body had been found on a wooded road in southern Indiana, that Anderson was apprehended in California and brought into custody. Her case was ultimately transferred to Kentucky, where additional proceedings have taken place. As of the time of this documentary, the legal process continues. Cairo Jordan was 5 years old. He spent 6 months as an unidentified child, nameless, unclaimed, a little boy whose disappearance had not prompted a single missing persons report from any adult who knew him. In a very real sense, Cairo was invisible in death in the same way that too many children in dangerous home situations are invisible in life. The systems designed to notice them, to check on them, to intervene on their behalf, never had the chance to reach him. He had a name. Cairo Jordan. He was 5 years old. He liked. We can only imagine what he liked, what made him laugh, what he was curious about, what he might have grown up to become. We know almost nothing about him except the circumstances of his death. And that is itself a form of tragedy. Cairo Jordan deserves to be remembered. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Every time you share one of these stories, you help make sure these children are never forgotten. Case 6. Chelsea Crossland. March 24, 2022. Jay County, Indiana. The little boy's name was Christian. He was 5 years old. And for 74 days, his mother beat him, starved him, choked him, and watched him die. When police arrived at Chelsea Crossland's home in Portland, Indiana on March 24, 2022, they found Christian Crossland wearing only a diaper, unresponsive on the floor of a filthy house. He had been alive that morning. By the time emergency services arrived, whatever small reserve of strength he had been holding on to for weeks was gone. Christian Crossland died from complications of blunt force trauma to his head and mouth, combined with the effects of severe, prolonged malnutrition. An autopsy laid out in clinical detail what had been done to his small body over the course of the 74 days between January 2022 and his death in late March. The findings documented injuries consistent with repeated beatings, evidence of strangulation, and the unmistakable physical markers of a child who had been deliberately deprived of food. He weighed almost nothing. His body had been consuming itself, trying to stay alive. The investigation that followed involved interviews with Christian's sisters, who were also in the home. What those children told investigators was devastating. They described a household where Christian was specifically targeted, where their mother, Chelsea Crossland, treated him differently from the other children, where food was withheld from him as punishment, where beatings were a regular occurrence. They said that Chelsea Crossland withheld food from Christian because he did not know his ABCs. They said, in the simple, heartbreaking language of children describing the inexplicable, that their mother didn't like him as much. A 5-year-old child was starved and beaten because he could not recite his alphabet. A 5-year-old child. The sisters also described the night Christian died. They told investigators that Chelsea Crossland had discussed what to do with his body. They said she had attempted to feed him shampoo. These details, offered by children old enough to observe and remember, but far too young to fully process what they were witnessing, painted a portrait of a home that had become, for Christian, a place of unrelenting suffering. A child abuse expert who testified at trial stated plainly and without qualification that Christian Crossland had been tortured. The trial of Chelsea Crossland took place in Jay County, Indiana. The evidence presented, the autopsy findings, the testimony of her own children, the physical condition of the home, the documented timeline of abuse, built a case that the jury found compelling and complete. Chelsea Crossland was convicted of murder. The jury recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole. That sentence was imposed by the trial court. Crossland appealed. The case went to the Indiana Supreme Court, which reviewed the evidence, the trial proceedings, and the sentence. In a unanimous decision, the Indiana Supreme Court upheld the conviction and the sentence. Chelsea Crossland will spend the rest of her life in prison. Christian Crossland will spend no more time anywhere. He was 5 years old, a little boy who liked and laughed and wondered and felt, who had sisters who saw what was happening to him and could not stop it, who lived in a house where one adult had decided he did not deserve the same care as the other children. He deserved exactly the same care. He deserved more. There is a particular cruelty in deliberate starvation, in the act of watching a child become thinner and weaker day by day and choosing, actively and repeatedly, not to feed them. It requires the daily renewal of a choice to harm. It is not a single act of violence, but an ongoing one, sustained over weeks and months, requiring the perpetrator to look at a suffering child every single day and decide again that the suffering will continue. Chelsea Crossland made that decision by the evidence presented at trial for 74 days, 74 mornings, 74 nights, 74 days during which Christian Crossland experienced hunger and pain and the confusion of a child who does not understand why the person he depends on most will not help him. He is gone now, but his name is Christian, and we will not forget it. Please like this video for Christian Crossland. Leave a comment below and share this documentary with someone who needs to hear these stories. Subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Together, we make sure these children are never reduced to statistics. Case 7. Caylin Monroe. February 15, 2022. Warwick County, Indiana. He was 3 months old. Silas Scott was 3 months old on February 15, 2022, when first responders were called to a home in Boonville, Indiana, in Warwick County. The call came in as a medical emergency, an infant who was not responsive. When paramedics arrived, Silas was already beyond saving. He was pronounced dead at the scene. 3 months old. He had been alive for approximately 90 days. He had never learned to sit up, never learned to crawl, never taken a single step or spoken a single word. He was at the very beginning of a life that had barely started, entirely dependent on the adults around him for every single thing. Every feeding, every moment of warmth, every breath of safe air. The cause of death, as determined by the medical examiner, was starvation. Silas Scott had starved to death. He was 3 months old, and he had starved to death in a home in Indiana in the 21st century, not from poverty or famine or any external deprivation, but because the person responsible for feeding him had chosen, repeatedly and consistently, not to do so. The autopsy was specific in its findings. Silas's stomach was completely empty. Not partially empty, not evidence of insufficient feeding, but completely empty. There was nothing in it. When investigators spoke to Silas's mother, Caylin Monroe, she told them that she sometimes missed feedings because she was busy. Busy. A 3-month-old infant, a human being who cannot feed himself, cannot ask for food, cannot do anything to address his own hunger except cry, was allowed to starve to death because his mother was busy. The investigation revealed that this was not the first time concerns had been raised about the welfare of children in Caylin Monroe's care. The Indiana Department of Child Services had previously investigated Monroe in connection with another child's weight. The investigation had not resulted in the removal of the child or in criminal charges at that time. Silas Scott was later born into the same household. The investigation into Silas's death was thorough and lengthy. Monroe was arrested in April of 2022, approximately 2 months after Silas died. The case proceeded through the Indiana court system over the following years, culminating in a trial that lasted 10 days in October of 2024. The jury heard the autopsy findings, the testimony of investigators, the medical evidence of what starvation does to an infant's body, and Monroe's own statements to detectives. They convicted her of felony murder. In November of 2024, Caylin Monroe was sentenced to 65 years in prison. She will be in her 80s, at minimum, before she is eligible for any consideration of release, if she lives that long. The infant's father, Jacob Scott, faces separate charges related to Silas's death. That case had not yet gone to trial at the time of this documentary's production. 65 years is a long sentence. It is not, by any measure, longer than the life that Silas Scott should have had. He should have had decades. He should have had birthdays and first days of school and summers and winters and all of the 10,000 ordinary experiences that make up a human life. He was given 90 days, and he spent the last stretch of those days in hunger that never got answered. There are support resources in Indiana and across the country for new parents who are struggling with postpartum depression, with the overwhelming demands of infant care, with mental health challenges, with poverty and isolation, and the 100 pressures that bear down on young parents in difficult circumstances. None of those resources require a parent to be perfect. They require only that a parent reach out. Silas Scott needed someone to reach out. No one did. Please like this video in memory of Silas Scott. Leave a comment below. His name deserves to be said out loud. And please subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Your support keeps this channel going and these stories alive. Case 8. Toni McClure. April 9, 2024. Marion County, Indiana. The most haunting detail in the case of Kinsley Welty is this. The Department of Child Services had received 6 reports about her welfare before she died. 6 reports. 6 times, someone who knew about this child, a neighbor, a teacher, a family acquaintance, a mandated reporter of some kind, looked at the situation and thought, something is wrong here. 6 times, they made the call that is supposed to trigger intervention. Kinsley Welty died on April 9, 2024. She was 5 years old. She weighed 21 pounds. To put that in context, the average weight of a healthy 5-year-old child is approximately 40 to 50 pounds. Kinsley Welty weighed 21 pounds, less, investigators discovered, than she had weighed when she was 2 years old. Her body had not grown. It had shrunk. She was 5 years old and she weighed less than she had at 2 because she had been systematically, deliberately, and lethally deprived of food for years. Toni McClure was Kinsley's mother. They lived on Denver Drive in Indianapolis, in Marion County. When emergency services were called to the home on April 9, 2024, they found Kinsley unresponsive. The autopsy would confirm what the condition of the child's body had already made clear. She had died from malnutrition resulting from neglect. But the investigation went further than the cause of death. What investigators uncovered inside that home, and in the documented history of this family, was a pattern of cruelty that had been in place for years. Kinsley had been confined, investigators found, in a closet. The closet was covered in feces. She had been locked away from the kitchen, from the refrigerator, from the food cabinets, surrounded by food that she was not allowed to access. She had been kept alive at a subsistence level while the rest of the household presumably ate and lived normally. This had not begun recently. The documentation of abuse stretched back years. Toni McClure had actually been convicted previously of neglect involving Kinsley, when the child was just 3 weeks old. 3 weeks old. A newborn had already been the subject of a neglect finding against her mother. A court had been involved. Child Protective Services had been involved. And still, the system ultimately returned Kinsley to Toni McClure in 2021. From 2021 until April of 2024, nearly 3 years, Kinsley Welty lived under her mother's care. During those 3 years, 6 reports were made to the Department of Child Services. During those 3 years, Kinsley went from a small child to a skeletal one, losing weight instead of gaining it, regressing instead of growing. During those 3 years, Toni McClure was still her mother of record, still the one in charge, still the one who held the power over whether her daughter ate that day. The Marion County Prosecutor's Office charged Toni McClure with murder and is seeking life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her trial is scheduled for June of 2026. The case has prompted significant discussion in Indiana about the child welfare system, about when children who have been removed from dangerous homes should be returned, about the weight given to parental rights versus child safety, about what it means when a system receives 6 reports about a child and that child still dies. These are difficult, necessary conversations that have no easy answers. What is clear is that Kinsley Welty had people in her life who were concerned enough to make those calls. What is also clear is that she needed more than concern. She needed intervention that stuck. She needed someone to look at a 5-year-old girl who weighed 21 pounds and say, "This child is not going back there." She needed that. She did not get it. Kinsley Welty was 5 years old. She weighed 21 pounds. She had been confined in a feces-covered closet. She had been locked away from food in her own home. And she had been the subject of a prior neglect finding since she was 3 weeks old. She deserved a different life. She deserved the most basic things: food, space, sunlight, the freedom to be a 5-year-old child in a home where someone was glad she was there. She deserved all of that. Every single bit of it. Kinsley Welty's name needs to be remembered. Please like this video, leave a comment, and share this documentary. And please subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. We are committed to covering cases like this one and making sure the children at the center of them are never forgotten. Case 9. Chantell Gardner. January 25, 2025. Marion County, Indiana. When Indianapolis police officers stepped through the door of Chantell Gardner's apartment on the north side of the city in late January of 2025, what they encountered stopped them in their tracks. The apartment was not just messy. It was not just poorly maintained. It was, in the words used in subsequent official reports and court filings, a biohazard. The floors were covered in human feces. Rotting food was piled throughout the living space. Garbage had accumulated to the point that navigating the apartment required moving through it. Soiled items of every kind were strewn across surfaces and floors. The smell was overwhelming. The conditions were, by any reasonable standard, incompatible with human habitation, and entirely incompatible with the survival of a 2-year-old child. Chantell Gardner had called police herself. She had reported that her 2-year-old daughter, Skylar, was missing. Then, during the course of that same interaction, she found Skylar, unresponsive, beneath a dresser. Skylar Gardner was 2 years old. She was already dead. The investigation that followed was detailed and thorough, and what it revealed about the conditions in which Skylar had been living and dying was as disturbing as anything investigators had documented in recent Marion County history. The apartment's furnace was broken. The temperature inside the unit had dropped to between 46 and 51 degrees Fahrenheit. It was January. A 2-year-old child had been living and dying in near-freezing indoor temperatures. Chantell Gardner had known the furnace was broken. She had not reported it. When investigators asked why, she gave an answer that was, in its own way, more damning than the physical evidence. She feared that if she reported the broken furnace, someone would come to the apartment and discover the conditions in which her children were living. She had chosen to allow her children to freeze rather than risk discovery of the neglect. The medical examiner determined that Skylar Gardner's cause of death was hypothermia. She froze to death in her own home. But the physical examination of Skylar's body revealed that hypothermia was only the final entry in a long catalog of harm. She had frostbite on her hands and her feet. She had bite marks across multiple areas of her body, marks consistent with rodent bites. She had a puncture wound on her neck that investigators believed was post-mortem, also consistent with rodent activity. She had bruising across her body. And when the autopsy was complete, the contents of her stomach revealed something that no one could hear without flinching: hair and feces. Skylar Gardner had been living in an apartment so unsanitary that rodents had access to her body. She had been living in temperatures so cold that her extremities had developed frostbite. She had ingested the waste that surrounded her. And she had died from the cold. Chantell Gardner told investigators that she left her children alone most of the time. She described a pattern of checking on them approximately once a day, delivering food during those brief visits. The children, Skylar and at least one other, were left alone for extended periods, in an apartment that was cold and filthy and dangerous, while their mother was elsewhere. Gardner was indicted on charges of murder and neglect. The case is proceeding through the Marion County court system. Skylar Gardner was 2 years old. She had frostbite. She had been bitten by rodents. She died in January, in an apartment in Indianapolis, in temperatures that should never have been allowed to exist in a home where a child was present. 2 years old. Barely out of infancy. Still in that stage of life where everything is new and surprising and most of the world is still a mystery waiting to be explored. Still needing her mother for everything, for warmth, for food, for safety, for the basic assurance that someone was paying attention. Someone was not paying attention. Someone was somewhere else. And Skylar Gardner died in the cold. Please like this video for Skylar Gardner. 2 years old. She deserved warmth and safety and everything a child deserves. Leave a comment, share this story, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. We will not let these children be forgotten. Case 10. Sophie Igou. September 17, 2025. Shelby County, Indiana. She called 911 to say that her baby was dead. That was how it began. A call, placed by Sophie Igou, to emergency services in Shelbyville, Indiana, on the morning of September 17, 2025. She told the dispatcher that her baby was dead. Officers were dispatched to the address. When they arrived, they found Sophie Igou standing in the driveway of the home, holding a child wrapped in a sheet. The child was 22-month-old Jasper Igou, her son. He was wrapped in a sheet because he had been dead for some time, not hours, but days, possibly longer. The decomposition was significant enough that investigators immediately recognized that this was not a sudden, unexpected death. This was a child who had died and whose body had remained in the home, undiscovered by emergency services, for an extended period. Jasper Igou had been dead in that house, and Sophie Igou had been in that house with him, and no one had called for help until that morning. When officers entered the home to conduct their investigation, they found conditions that were described in subsequent reporting as a hoarding environment. Refuse covered the floors and surfaces. The house was infested with insects. Decomposing material was found in Jasper's crib. The space where a toddler should have been sleeping in safety and comfort was instead a place thick with the evidence of profound, chronic neglect. Jasper Igou was 22 months old. His body weighed 14 pounds. The average weight of a healthy 22-month-old child is somewhere between 24 and 28 pounds. Jasper weighed 14. He weighed, investigators discovered, only 4 pounds more than he had weighed at his last medical appointment, an appointment that had taken place when he was 2 months old. 2 months old. That was the last time Jasper Igou had seen a doctor. For the remaining 20 months of his life, for nearly 2 years, he had received no medical care whatsoever. He had grown from an infant to a toddler in a hoarded, insect-infested home, without a single medical visit, without a single checkup, without a single professional setting eyes on him and assessing whether he was healthy, whether he was thriving, whether he was receiving even the minimum of what a growing child needs. He was not thriving. He had gained 4 pounds in 20 months. He was 22 months old, and he weighed 14 pounds. When police informed Sophie Igou of the extent of the decomposition, when they told her how long Jasper appeared to have been dead, she asked them a question that has since been repeated in every account of this case. She asked, "Did I do this?" It was a question that, in its own way, contained its own answer. Sophie Igou was charged with 5 felony counts of neglect of a dependent resulting in death. The charges reflect the documented pattern of failure, not a single act, not a single moment of negligence, but a sustained, months-long pattern of failing to provide this child with the food, medical care, safe living conditions, and basic attention that he needed to survive. The Shelbyville Police Department and Shelby County investigators worked the case carefully, documenting the conditions of the home, the child's medical history, the timeline of Jasper's life from his last known medical visit to the morning of September 17, 2025. The evidence they assembled told the story of a child who had been invisible, not to a county, not to a city, but to his own mother. 22 months. Jasper Igou was 22 months old. He was at the age where toddlers are beginning to form words, beginning to run and fall and get back up, beginning to develop the first outlines of a personality that will take decades to fully become. He was at the very beginning of becoming himself. He weighed 14 pounds. There are things that a mother does automatically, instinctively, that require no instruction and no special knowledge. She feeds her child. She takes her child to the doctor when the child is not growing. She looks at her child and notices that something is wrong. She calls for help. These are not heroic acts. They are the bare minimum. They are the floor, not the ceiling, of what it means to care for a child. Jasper Igou needed the floor. He needed the very minimum. He did not receive it. Sophie Igou stood in that driveway holding her son's body wrapped in a sheet, and she asked whether she had done this. The question suggests, somewhere in her, a recognition of the connection between her choices and her son's death. Whether the legal proceedings will fully answer that question is something the Shelby County court system will determine. What is already answered, by the weight of a 14-pound toddler and the absence of a medical record spanning 20 months of a child's life, is the question of whether Jasper was failed. He was, completely, irrevocably, and too late for anything to be undone. His name was Jasper. He was 22 months old. He was real, and he mattered, and he deserved a childhood. There is a question that runs through every single one of the cases you have just heard, a question that is impossible to ignore once you have sat with all 10 stories together. How does this happen? How does a child starve to death in a country with food banks and social services and mandatory reporting laws? How does a toddler die of hypothermia in an apartment in the middle of a city while adults move through that same city unaware? How does a 5-year-old boy lose 20% of his body weight over 74 days without anyone outside his home noticing? How does a 3-month-old infant die with an empty stomach when there are hotlines and home visiting programs and pediatricians trained to recognize the signs of deprivation? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. The answer involves systems that are understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed. It involves communities where the instinct to respect the private space of a home sometimes overpowers the instinct to ask whether the children inside that home are safe. It involves the complex reality that removing a child from their parent is traumatic in its own right, and that child welfare professionals face an almost impossible task in trying to determine when the risk of staying outweighs the harm of leaving. But the answer also involves something simpler and harder: the individual choices made by the women in these 10 cases. Gertrude Baniszewski chose to allow her home to become a chamber of abuse for a child who had been placed in her care. Amber Pasztor chose to end her children's lives rather than accept the limits of her custody arrangement. Brandi Worley chose to purchase a knife and hide it, and use it rather than face the prospect of a divorce. Naomi Briner chose something in that rural house on East Telegraph Hill Road that her children could not survive. DeJuane Anderson chose to believe that her son was something other than a 5-year-old boy who needed food and care and love. Chelsea Crossland chose, day after day for 74 days, to withhold food from a child who could not feed himself. Caylin Monroe chose to prioritize being busy over keeping her 3-month-old son alive. Toni McClure chose to confine a child in a closet and lock the refrigerator while her daughter's body consumed itself from within. Chantell Gardner chose to leave her children alone in a freezing, filthy apartment and check on them once a day like they were houseplants. Sophie Igou chose not to call a doctor for 20 months, not to feed her child enough to grow, not to ask for help until her son was already gone. These were choices. They were made by human beings who had the capacity to choose differently. And the children who bore the consequences of those choices had no say in any of it. Sylvia Likens, Liliana Hernandez, Renee Pasztor, Tyler Worley, Charlie Worley, Adelia Briner, Leland Briner, Isla Briner, Cairo Jordan, Christian Crossland, Silas Scott, Kinsley Welty, Skylar Gardner, Jasper Igou. 14 names, 14 children, 14 lives that ended before they had a chance to fully begin. We say their names here, on this channel, because saying their names is the smallest and most essential act of witness. Because they existed. Because they were real. Because the world is different, emptier, quieter, smaller, in their absence. And because if there is any purpose to the telling of these stories, it is this: that the next child who needs someone to notice, the next time a teacher sees something that troubles her, or a neighbor hears something that stops her cold, or a family member knows something that weighs on him, that the next person who is in a position to intervene does not hesitate. Not because it is easy, because it is necessary. Because a child's life is worth the discomfort of making the call, filing the report, asking the hard question. These stories are difficult to hear. They are more difficult to have lived. But silence does not protect children. Attention does. Action does. Community does. We are True Crime Silent Files. We will not be silent. We will keep telling these stories, keep saying these names, keep making the case that children's lives matter and that the people entrusted with those lives bear a responsibility that is absolute. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough to sit with these stories from beginning to end. If this documentary moved you, if it made you think or grieve or feel the particular anger that comes from bearing witness to injustice, please like this video. Leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear these stories. Every action you take helps this channel reach more people and ensures that these cases do not disappear into the digital silence. And please, if you have not yet subscribed to True Crime Silent Files, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell so you are there when the next documentary goes live. We do this work because it matters. And your presence here, watching and listening and caring, is what makes it possible. These children were real. Their stories are real. And as long as this channel exists, they will not be forgotten. True Crime Silent Files. Because silence is not an option.